So hello, I'm John Morewood, and this is my podcast on the British Shutter Telegraph system, a system set up by the Admiralty between 1796 and 1814 to communicate between the Admiralty in London and the naval anchorages. It led to 60 stations being set up in southern England and East Anglia. Apart from one site, none of these now remain, and they only feature by such names as Telegraph Hill or Telegraph Lane. This is what the network actually looked like. As I've said, about 60 stations, each one between 6 and 11 miles away from its next one in the line. The first one was set up between the Admiralty and Deal, followed by the Admiralty and Portsmouth, both in 1796. One followed between the Admiralty and Plymouth, and it may at some stage been extended to Falmouth, we don't know. And the final one was set up in 1808 between the Admiralty in London and Yarmouth. The system was expensive. It was, they reckon, £40 per mile to actually construct, and £40 per annum per mile to actually maintain. It took staff, and the real truth is if the Admiralty could have got away with not setting this up, it would have done so. In its view, it had a system that worked perfectly well. Thanks to the Royal Mail, it was able to send messages by courier or by fast post chase without any cost at all. It would take 4.5 hours to get a message from the Admiralty in London to Portsmouth, and in the old days, 2 days from Yarmouth to the Admiralty had been reduced by our time to just over a day. So why did the Admiralty feel it was necessary to set up this complicated system? And the real truth was that the French had stolen a march on us. The French had much more detailed maps. They had disestablished the church, so they had a lot of towers going spare to actually set up a system to communicate between the government in Paris and the French armies in the field. And that was its objective. What they needed was a system. And that came from the man on the left, the Abbé Claude Chappe, 1763 to 1805. He came from a family that were interested in science and innovation. His uncle had been interested in astronomy. And Chappe came up with the system that you can now see on the tower there. Basically, he established towers across France, 8 miles apart from each other. There was a 12-foot beam on top of a mast, 18 foot high. Attached to the beam were 3-foot arms operated by ropes, and they could be set at various angles, 45 degrees usually. And they were actually, as I said, the angle was determined by ropes that were operated by a mechanism in the actual tower itself. There were a potential for 256 different combinations by this system. And it was very, very advanced. Messages were set in code. And that was something that our British Shutter Telegraph system never managed to achieve. And the message could be sent very, very quickly. To give you an example, the French government in 1794 announced that they had received a message by telegraph that the French army had actually conquered and captured the town of Condé from the Austrians. That had been a message sent on the first line from Paris to Lille, 135 miles, 8 stations. The French Legislative Assembly decided that they would actually rename the town Nord Libre, and they asked for a message to be sent by telegraph to inform the French commander that should be done. At the end of the parliamentary session, a member of the French government was able to stand up and say, "Your message has been sent, received, and acknowledged." And I can now tell you that the courier has actually now been sent from Lille to what was formerly Condé to say that its name will be changed. Chappe wanted to call this originally tachograph, fast writer in Greek, but the French military didn't like that, so they decided to call it far writer, telegraph. Later on in 1801, a coastal system will be designed, which was called semaphore, carrying sign, and Shab would end up calling his system semaphore telegraph. We found out about it because, of course, with message being sent to Lille in Flanders, that was where the Grand Old Duke of York was campaigning. And his chaplain, with the rather sad name for a clergyman, the Reverend John Gamble, actually decided to come up with an alternative. But before we do, let's look at how advanced geography-wise the system actually was. And you'll see messages sent here from a French naval base at Brest to Paris, and then on to Amsterdam, to Mainz, to Strasbourg, and ultimately via 130 stations to Venice, 700 miles away. And the system, because it was sending messages in code, was very, very quick. In fact, it is said that when they needed in 1811 to communicate that Napoleon now had a son, the message was actually sent from Paris to Strasbourg in 60 minutes. So what was the British alternative going to be? Fortunately, seeing as we were in catch-up mode, we did have some innovations that we could actually use. The first one was on the left, and that is a Dollond telescope. The French obviously had bought one of these as well and developed their own. But this was the invention of a man called John Dollond. Think of the current firm, Dollond Etchison, and you'd be right. And he produced a telescope for the army in 1780, whereby they could observe sites 11 miles away. And that was going to be very important for the actual distance between the telegraph stations. Also, thanks to a gentleman called Jesse Ramsden, we have now got a thing called the theodolite. And that was going to be very, very important for actually working out the heights and where the station should be. And indeed, a great deal of the work in southern England had already been done as part of a collaboration with the French during the years of peace to actually establish the longitude, latitude, and height of the opposing observatories of Paris, Greenwich. That had been masterminded by the only department in the British Army that was good at doing this sort of thing, the Ordnance Department. And the gentleman conducting it was Major General William Roy. And later on, his work, again supervised by the Ordnance Department, will become the world-famous Ordnance Survey that we know between 1790 and 1850. So by the time that we knew that we had to do something, we had the telescopes, we knew where the stations had to be built, we just didn't have a system. And that came from this man. For some reason, the business did not go to Gamble. It went to the man called the Reverend Lord George Murray. And he came up with a shutter system, a shutter telegraph, where messages were sent by the shutters actually being displayed vertically, as you can see on the top two, or horizontally, as you can see on the bottom one on the left. It had a lot less permutations than the French system. You know, there was no way you could actually manage 256 different positions. But nevertheless, it was very cheap and it was able to be set up very, very quickly. And indeed, from inception to the first telegraph line being set between the Admiralty in London and the naval anchorage at Deal, the time for setting up that line was actually 4 months. The signal that it's actually sending here, the shutters actually could only be used to send a letter or a number or a direction. So there wasn't any sending of anything in code, which meant that the British system would be sending messages and take a long time to do so. This message that is displayed here is a signal for north. How did the actual system operate? Originally, 2 lieutenants, each with telescopes, one looking down the line, one looking up the line, and then 2 sailors actually pulling on ropes to actually set up the shutter system. The one that you've got actually here is the another directional symbol. By the time we get to the the actual 1811, 1812, it's very likely that given the problems that Navy had of manpower, it was perhaps one lieutenant, one midshipman, and perhaps two sailors manning each of these stations. This is what the system actually looked like when it was finished. I've been looking at the line from the Admiralty in London to that in Yarmouth. And I've been doing this because the only tower that still exists is the medieval clock tower in St Albans, on which, as you'll see, there is the Shutter Telegraph. And the signal it is sending is the addressee, the Port Admiral at Yarmouth. Now, there's many legends about how quickly messages can be set up and down the line. And a lot of this is Royal Navy propaganda, because the Gog Magog Hills telegraph station, actually we still hold copies of some of its records on how long it took to send a signal. And it did record that in the years 1812 and 1813, it took 2 minutes to send a message to the next station along the line, i.e. Newmarket, with 3 resets, which means, of course, given the number of stations, a very simple message going from the Admiralty to Yarmouth in 38 minutes. Much more complicated messages took greater time. And a message is actually stated as taking, with 21 resets, 29 minutes to send from the actual Gog Magog Hills to Newmarket. So that means a message, that complicated message, would take 9 hours to send. But that's still, of course, much quicker than actually sending it by horse and taking over a day. One of the problems, of course, was fog. There were a lot of occasions where the actual signal from the other actual stations couldn't be seen and therefore couldn't be communicated. And sometimes horses were stationed to actually take the message from a fog-bound area to one that wasn't fog-bound, lower down the line, in order to send the message. So there we are, 19 stations running along this line from the Admiralty to Yarmouth between 1808 and 1814. What sort of message were being sent down the line? Well, the reason why we had a naval anchorage at Yarmouth was, of course, our control and need to exercise control in the Baltic. From the Baltic actually came things essential for the Royal Navy: spars for the masts, and more importantly, rope in the form of hemp. And going into the Baltic was trade through the Hanseatic ports to actually break the Napoleon's continental system. But one of the most celebrated things going down the line would be a message for certain transports to join the Baltic fleet in the actual Baltic in 1808, in August, to play a part in actually, literally airlifting the Spanish army under the Duke, the Marquess de la Romana, 9,000 men who didn't want to fight for France anymore following the French invasion of Spain. And we actually picked them up from Denmark and transported them all the way to Spain, to Galicia, where they could actually serve against the French. And that is one of the most celebrated uses of the telegraph for the Admiralty to Yarmouth line. The first message that was actually sent was simply the message, "Calypso is ready for sea." Come 1814, the Admiralty, desperate to save money, simply closed down the lines. And therefore, it's got a little bit on the hop when it needed to communicate the messages that Napoleon had returned from Elba. So later on, Home Riggs Popham will be brought in to actually look at the French system, and a different system to show it was different. It was called semaphore, and semaphore towers were sent to communicate by code from London to Portsmouth. That system continued until 1847, when, of course, we got the electric telegraph. And to show again that it was a new system, the word telegraph was used. In 1850, a new word was coined, telegram. So there we are, a temporary system set up by the Admiralty, but one that was very effective. Although, obviously, you might not have been able to send messages up and down the line in 5 minutes. Thank you so much for actually listening and watching this presentation.